Before we go over malware, viruses, Trojans, rootkits, and many other malicious software, let's actually define what are threats, what are vulnerabilities, and what are exploits, and try to understand how the whole life cycle of malware and exploitation takes place. So the first thing that I want to define is what is a threat. A threat is actually any potential danger to an asset. If a vulnerability exists but it doesn't have an exploit or it hasn't been exploited, or if it is actually not publicly known, we consider that threat to be latent or not yet realized. But threats can be pretty much anything. It can be things like fire, somebody stealing your laptop, a specific, disaster, like a national disaster and so on. Now, a vulnerability, on the other hand, is a weakness in a system or the system design and implementation, and it can be actually in software or in hardware as well. So a lot of people actually think that vulnerabilities are only in software, but vulnerabilities are absolutely in hardware as well. Another thing that I want to highlight is that no software or hardware is immune to vulnerabilities. Anything is actually susceptible to be, to actually have a vulnerability, right? And vulnerabilities can be found in applications, in operating systems. I mentioned hardware. Also, some misconfigurations it can lead into vulnerabilities and insecure states. And you can also have vulnerabilities in things like shrink wrap software and many others out there. Now, vendors, security researchers, and vulnerability coordination centers typically assign vulnerabilities an identifier, and that identifier is known as the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE. Now, CVE is an industry standard. It's actually sponsored by MITRE and the US CERT. It's actually maintained by MITRE. However, it is not a type of vulnerability. It's not actually a vulnerability itself. It's just an identifier to make it easy for you to actually correlate across tools, vulnerability repositories, and security services, and so on. Now, an exploit is basically a recipe or a piece of software, right? It can be just a very small script, a tool, or a sophisticated tool that will actually take advantage of a vulnerability, right? And then that leads to many different things depending on what the vulnerability is all about. It can lead to access to a system, full compromise, privilege escalation, loss of integrity, denial of service, of a computer system, and so on. Now, not all vulnerabilities actually have exploits, and not all vulnerabilities can be exploited itself, right? So there are some vulnerabilities that, of course, the attack surface makes it a little bit more difficult for an attacker to actually exploit that vulnerability. If you want to actually get familiarized with examples of exploits, I'm sharing here the exploit database, which is a site maintained by Offensive Security that people actually upload different types of exploits for different vulnerabilities in the industry. Now let's go over traditional viruses and worms. And this is actually something that you're probably already familiar with since it's nothing new, right? So viruses actually have been around for quite some time, even back to the 1980s, right? Or probably even, before that. And there are many different types of viruses that can actually take advantage of your, some vulnerabilities or actually, infect your systems to do many things, to encrypt your files or steal your files, delete them, just put, some messages in the screen for interacting with the user and many other, applications. Now, there are different types of transmission methods of viruses and worms. One of the most popular are the master boot record infection, and this is actually the original method of attack, where the attacker actually compromises the master boot record of the hard drive of the system. The other one is BIOS infection, and of course, compromising and taking advantage of BIOS vulnerabilities. File infection is another type. Macros, macros included in programs like Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and so on. Those have been very popular in the past. And there are many, many different other type of infection mechanisms that can be over the network, propagating, over the network. Historically, we actually have seen things like ransomware, which are different types of, a type of malware that encrypts files in your system, and then it asks the user for a ransom, so for the user to actually pay in order for files to be unencrypted. In most cases, that's not the case. Even if the user pays, they will not get a key for the decrypting those files. But in the past, we actually have seen some of those type of attacks and malware propagated and be like a worm, and doing that by leveraging vulnerabilities, especially in the Microsoft operating system and on ports like TCP port 445, for example, right? But there are many different types of propagation that we actually have seen in the industry. Now, another thing that I want to actually cover is malware payloads. Malware must place their payload somewhere, right? They can always overwrite a portion of the infected file, but to do so, it will actually have to destroy it. But most malware writers want to avoid detection for as long as possible. And one of the things that they actually try to do is have different type of infection techniques and payload techniques to potentially, obfuscate and bypass security controls that you may have in place. And tons of malware actually have different search routines and infection routines, like search routines. Search is actually responsible for locating new files or disk space or RAM, so memory, to infect a system. Another one is actually the quote-unquote infection technique, which actually is considered a second component of a virus or a worm as the infection method. And basically, this portion of the malware or virus is actually responsible for copying the virus and attaching it to a suitable host, right? So malware could also use a reinfect or restart routine to further then compromise the affected system. You don't have to actually know all this level of detail for the exam, but it provides you, a little bit more of a background of, the different type of infection routines that exist within malware and viruses. Now let's go back to payload. Payload is actually something that a lot of people refer to in the industry, that word payload, in many different ways, but they mean different things, right? At the end of the day, the purpose of the payload or the payload routine on malware, it may be to do things like erasing files on the hard drive, right, or the whole hard drive, or display messages to the monitor for a user to actually follow a malicious link or to provide sensitive information, or probably for propagating the virus or the worm or the ransomware to many other people across the organization, right? So at the end of the day, that payload is actually constructed to do some type of malfeasance, against the user or against the actual target. And there are also different anti-forensics techniques that malware can incorporate, or malware writers can incorporate, to obfuscate their techniques and also to prevent for the good guys to be able to actually reverse engineer and do forensics of that given malware. Now let's define what are Trojans. Trojans are actually programs that actually pretend to do one thing, but whenever you load them, actually they perform another function, a malicious act, right? So everybody's familiar with the concept of a Trojan horse, right? The Greeks tricked the Trojans to bring a large wooden horse to a fortified city of Troy. So, software Trojans, or a software Trojan horse, is actually based on the same concept. You may actually think that the file or the program actually looks harmless and it's actually safe to run, but whenever you actually execute the program or the piece of software, it actually delivers a malicious payload, right? And that can actually present themselves in many different ways, right? Like a PDF in an email, right? Or a Word document or a spreadsheet or a specific executable. Now, there are different types of Trojan types. There's remote access Trojans, or RATs, that basically allow the attacker to have full control over the actual compromised system. An example of this is like Poison Ivy and many others in the industry. There's another purpose or another type, call it a Trojan horse for data hiding. So the idea behind this type of Trojan is to hide, the user's data, right? Now, another example of another type of Trojan is e-banking Trojans. And basically, those are Trojans that intercept and use the victim banking information for financial gains, right? There are also Trojans that actually have been done or designed to cause a denial of service attacks as well, right? There are proxy Trojans, And basically, these Trojans are designed to work as a proxy program that help an attacker hide and allow himself or herself to perform activities from a victim's computer and not his own. There are many other types. There's FTP Trojans designed to work with port 21 over FTP. There's security software disablers, and these Trojans are actually designed to attack and kill antivirus or software firewalls and many others. Now, there are many different types of distribution techniques for malware, right? There's this concept called wrappers, and wrappers offer attackers a method to actually slip by a user's normal defenses, right? So this wrapper program is actually used to combine two or more executables into a single package program, right? Now, wrappers are also referred to as binders, packagers, and exe binders, and many others. There's so many different ways that the industry has referred to wrappers. Another concept is called packers, and packers are actually similar to programs such as WinZip or RAR or tar, because they actually compress files, and these compressed files, of course, will save not only space but also try to obfuscate the activity of the malware. Another concept is droppers, and droppers are software designed to install malware payloads on the target system. Basically, they try to avoid detection and evade security controls by using several methods to spread and install the malware payload. Now, cryptors is another concept that I want to share with you, and cryptors actually, are pieces of functionality in software, right, of malware, that the main purpose is actually to encrypt and obscure the code, or also obfuscate the techniques, right? Some cryptors obscure the contents of the Trojan or the malware or ransomware by applying an encryption algorithm, right? And they can actually use anything from like AES, RSA, blowfish, and many other type of techniques, out there. And later in the course, especially in lesson 2, you will learn about cryptography and the different types of encryption protocols and hashing algorithms. Now, one piece of malware that has been extremely popular in the early 2010s all the way to today's days is ransomware, right? Ransomware has been used by criminals making out of their victims, and also even by hacktivists and nation-state attackers to cause disruption. And basically, at the end of the day, a ransomware is a piece of software, a piece of malware that will encrypt files or the whole operating system or the whole hard drive, depending on the type of malware, and it will ask the user for a ransom, as I mentioned to you before, right? So if the user pays a ransom, he or she may, in many cases, not get, right? It's more often that they will not get the encryption keys to decrypt the contents of their files, right? So in many different scenarios, we actually have seen not only criminals, making money out of this, but also nation-state attackers causing disruption. And there's so many examples of popular malware out there, like WannaCry, NotPetya or Niera, and Bad Rabbit, and many others out there.